Welcome to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises, the program where we take a look at the book of Revelation in a fresh way, and particularly an intergenerational perspective. I'm John Pauline. I am a professor of religion at Loma Linda University, and I have a couple colleagues with me here.
I'm Guilherme Borda, and I'm a PhD student at Andrews University.
Hey everybody, I'm Nick Snell. I'm I guess, children's, youth, and young adult pastor at the Chapel Oaks Church here in Shawnee, Kansas.
So we get at least two generations just out of you, right? With you and the kids that you're working with. Well, yeah. We're right there. Do you ever talk about Revelation with the kids, and what age level are they?
Yeah, so I focus on the junior high and high school ages, and I just started working with the young adults, and I kind of more help coordinate for the children's ministry, but I'm kind of overseeing from 0 to 40, depending on how people think about church and how they want to interact with it. But yeah, I just started here in January, and I don't think we've gotten into Revelation a whole lot.
Okay. So that's very interesting to me that this is a new generation coming up, and Revelation has meant a lot to previous generations, particularly Seventh-day Adventists, also many other Protestants in particular. So let's see what we can do with one of the most interesting texts in the Bible, and that's Revelation 13:12 to 14. Nick, why don't you read that for us?
Sure. I'm reading from the New International Version. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived.
All right. So I hope all of you are able to follow in your own versions. If you don't have it, you may want to go get one quick, and so you can follow along. So Guilherme and Nick, what do you observe as you look at these three verses? Anything jump out at you?
Yes, there's this connection, just as you have a connection between the dragon and the sea beast in terms of a power connection. You have this power connection between the sea beast and the earth beast, right? It says that he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence or on his behalf. It depends on how you translate that, right? So you have that chain of authority and power.
I like that. I like that. I hadn't been thinking in those terms as we just read it. You remember we talked last time about the Holy Spirit being not pushing himself forward, but pushing Jesus forward, and we see that same dynamic here.
Yes, it's very interesting because it makes it exercises the authority of the first beast, right? So it is, in a sense, how could you say? It's like, remember in Genesis when Joseph would basically rule a significant portion of the business in Egypt, especially that thing that had to do with preparing for the big famine that was coming, right? He was, in a sense, exercising the authority of Pharaoh on his behalf, right? So you have someone who is working with someone else's authority or exercising that other person's authority on that person's behalf. So you would understand here that there would be some sort of an approval, right? That one would say, go ahead, you can use my authority, you can speak in my name, you can do things as if it were me. Whatever you do is going to be as if I were to do it. It's similar that the church sometimes in the the New Testament seems to imply that the Christians have a little bit of that when it comes to Jesus, right? Because they are to pray, they are to proclaim the gospel, to do all these things, but it is with the power of Jesus
on earth here,
representing him, speaking on his behalf, and so forth. Right? So you have that connection. But here you have that idea, right? That this one beast acting in the presence or on the behalf of the other with with the sea beast's authority.
I got to share what you brought to my mind. Come with me to Revelation 16. We invite the audience as well to follow us. Revelation 16 and verse 19. It says, the great city split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. All right. So Babylon here has 3 parts. And the question is, what are those 3 parts? You go back to verse 13, and it says, then I saw 3 evil spirits that looked like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. Who are those guys? That's the 3 guys of chapter 13. You have the dragon, beast from the sea, which is called the beast after that. And then beast from the earth is called the false prophet, like the Holy Spirit, bringing fire down from heaven. So the 3 parts of Babylon, I would argue, are the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. These 3 guys in chapter 13 together make up Babylon, which is only named later on in the book. But you see a group thing. So this, I think that goes what you were saying, Guilherme, that these 3 are working very closely together. They're a unit, just like the Godhead. Nick, what did you observe in the text?
I actually was drawn to the very next part after Guilherme left off, where it says that it made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast. There's this forced worship of the first beast that is, put into effect by the second beast. You ended up muted, Dr. Pauline.
So you were seeing there the idea of forced worship. That comes through very strongly in verse 15 yes. and beyond, where you have the image being set up and demanding worship, or else you'll lose your job, your life, whatever, your chance to buy and sell, your chance to eat, etc. So the idea of forced worship, is Satan imaging on God there?
What do you mean? Can you say it again?
A false image, Okay. There's this attempt to establish an illegitimate object of worship as an alternative to the only true object of worship, who is God, right? Mm-hmm. And you have there's some interesting things here, because in this thing of the forced worship, because the land beast is exercising the sea beast's authority. But while it exercises the sea beast's authority, it got to have some power, to do that. Is it just the power conferred by the sea beast? Or is the earth beast itself strong that it can, now it just has the legitimacy from the sea beast? However that is working, they're working in a way to bring worship to that sea beast, which later we'll see, it will not only be the sea beast that will get that worship, because ultimately, going back to that chain of command, ultimately this is a scheme orchestrated by the dragon, wanting worship to be ultimately directed toward him, right? They're causing that, And now the chain is going to go in the reverse way. Instead of being dragon, sea beast to land beast, now it's going to be land beast points people to the sea beast, and the sea beast leads people to the dragon, right? So the chain of command and authority goes one way, and the chain of worship goes the opposite way.
And I guess what I was trying to ask Nick a little earlier is, does God ever force worship? Here you were pointing out that Satan is making, through the land beast, is making people worship. Is that modeled on God, is what I was asking? Or does God do worship differently?
I think that Satan would accuse God of, maybe manipulation or something like that. But I think the whole great controversy is over, that God is just and true in all of his ways. So I would say no. But one thing that I was thinking about is going back to what Guilherme was saying earlier in regards to Jesus kind of giving some authority to the church, right? He says all authority in heaven and on earth is, mine, and I'm with you. So go make, disciples. But there's another place that I think is kind of controversial between Protestants and Roman Catholics, where some would say that Jesus' authority was transferred to Peter, and then Peter to the next person in this what's called apostolic succession, where Jesus said, you are Peter. Then he talks about the rock that he's going to build the church on, right? And people think that it's being built on Peter. And then Protestants would say, well, no, that's not what he meant. Jesus is the rock. And so some people would trace that authority in the church that Guilherme was talking about one way, and some people would trace it a different way. So I just was curious about your thoughts on that.
I guess what I'm wondering here is, if God never forces anyone, why do so many people feel forced in relation to the church?
Like parents making their kids go to church kind of a thing, something I see kind of often as a youth pastor.
Is that appropriate?
That's a great question. People, parents will say, well, as long as you live in my house, you got to come to church with me. And then their kids go to college and they stop going, or, yeah, great question.
Well, I wonder if we could dissect the question a little bit and maybe split. Sorry for that. But
I feel like I'm about to get dissected here.
No, not you. No, it's just that I think that when we ask, does God force people to worship? We could maybe try to explore different expressions and different models for the situation. So, for example, let's phrase the question a little bit different and see if it's easier to answer the other one, and then we move to this one. But the answer I think will be different. So does God demand worship? You see, I think from the Bible, God does seem to demand worship. He tells, he says, for one thing, he tells the people of Israel to be holy because he is holy. And then he gives them instructions of how they are supposed to do things. God definitely warns against worshiping any alternative object of worship. I think it's fair to say that God demands worship. The thing also is how people will define to demand. right? Should I say, I don't know. You probably see what I'm trying to go is to
I'll
go
give you
to a
Revelation.
neighboring word.
Revelation 14:7. Worship him who made heaven and earth.
Exactly.
That's a command.
Exactly. That's a clear one still in Revelation. Exactly.
So God is forcing people and Satan is forcing people. How do you tell the difference?
Well, you see, I don't know if I would use the word that God is forcing, even though it all depends on, for some people, what we might describe in Revelation, they would say, for me, that's forcing. I think it depends also on how we define the terms, because some people would say, no, you may say he's demanding, but he's not forcing, or someone says they're the same thing, he is forcing. So it's probably good to try to define that. I think one thing that I think it's important to understand is, first, is God worthy of worship? Does he have a right to that? Because a lot of people talk today about demanding the respect for their rights, right? So people in my generation, we are very, very, very worked up with issues of justice. We really care about justice. However, when you think about justice and worship, to consciously, informedly refuse to worship God is the greatest injustice of all. It is basically a form of silent blasphemy. It is a rejection of his authority. It is insurrection. It is rebellion against his kingdom. It is assigning the sheep to go join the army of the dark forces that are trying to bring death and chaos to us. So when you think about it, there's that. It's a situation of war. It's one side or the other. You can't stay. So I don't know. I don't know exactly how to address your question, but I think however we address it, there is at least a sense in which God does demand. And if we do not comply with that demand, we'll be killed. That's basically what he says in Revelation chapter 14. It is pretty stark and strong. And for many people, it sounds very harsh. But I think once we start to understand a little bit more everything that is involved, I think it should be understood that it is fair and just, and not only that, but desirable. And it may not seem like that at first.
Let me give you three things that tell me God never forces. Even though the language, definitely you often have the language of command, but the language of command in Greek can also be an exhortation. Please do this. This is really good for you. Stuff like that. So maybe the command thing is not so good. But first of all, Garden of Eden. God did not force Adam and Eve to choose him. He gave them the two trees. Right from the start, there was freedom in all of that. He gave them the power to procreate. There's a lot of freedom right there. Another point, if God forced people to worship, we'd all be worshiping him. Because he's the most powerful being in the universe. So if he wanted to force us to worship, we would not have a choice. We would be like robots in the matter. And that reminds me of an atheist I sat across the table from once at a funeral. They had a little snack afterward, and he was talking about his atheism. And then he said, I have to tell you, the last week a weird thought came to me. What if I'm wrong? What if there is a God? And I thought that through, and the result was that if there is a God, he must be very merciful, because I'm still here. And I thought, bam, if God forces anybody, this guy is living evidence that God doesn't force, and that God, rather than being vindictive, is extremely merciful. So anyway, any recommendation for parents who don't want to force their children to church, Nick? Is that appropriate when a kid is 7? Is it appropriate when they are 10? Is it appropriate when they're 13? Parents here, they're going to want to know this. So how would you respond?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times it's how you frame it, right? If you're going to be punished for not going to church, I mean, or maybe it's not even an option, you're just forced to go. But I think it's important to, sometimes church can be hard for kids. Sometimes it feels like, hey, this church is super small. There's nothing here for me. There's no kids, or you know what I mean? There can be a lot of reasons that a kid wouldn't want to go to church. Maybe the way the service is done just doesn't make sense to the kid. There's a lot of reasons. And so I guess my counsel would be to focus on the relationships of church, that help them to have connections, not just when you go there on Sabbath morning, but can you invite people over that your kids would enjoy? You want to make spiritual things joyful as soon as possible. Don't make church just something, or your faith something that only happens for a few hours on Sabbath morning. It needs to be kind of your life. So if you're thinking you're going to drop them off with me and I'm going to fix everything, you've got another thing coming.
That's above your pay rate.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I think this is our prophetic surprise. We didn't expect to end up here when we read these particular verses, but it's very relevant, isn't it, to the whole idea of force. Let me just say that the relationship between parent and child is an ever-growing one of releasing to the child freedoms to make decisions. Perhaps, when the child is 1 year old, you can give them the choice to eat with their fingers or eat with the spoon, and on a given day, they might like one or the other, when the kid's 4 years old, would you like to wear the blue shirt or the red shirt? So you can give them choices that don't offer harm, and you're training them to make decisions for themselves. The decision of whether or not to have God in your life is probably too momentous a decision to give to a 7-year-old in the typical context, or certainly a 7-month-old. And I think parents who raise their kids to choose, right from day one, usually doesn't work out very well. So I think parents saying, look, family's going to church today, and you're part of the family. So that's all there is to it. But when we get home, and if you didn't have a good time, we can talk about it, and we can share with you why for us it was important that we did this, and talk about maybe how to make it more fun. So going to church is probably not going to be an option for a kid that's under 10, certainly. In my view, probably under 16. Say, hey, we're going, come on along. You're part of the family and stuff, and we'll talk about it afterward.
But that discussion about this family dynamic, I think, is informative, for also the question that you raised: does God force to worship? Because I think the question is often a matter of perspective. Like I said, I think it's clear that God demands worship, but the word to force is often evoked with a pejorative connotation.
Good point.
Right?
Good
point. So for someone to say God demands worship, it may be their way to describe what someone else would describe God forces. But these are two different perspectives on the same thing. One may be more positive and the other more negative, which depends on how you see that reality, right? So I think that's how I would try to reconcile it. For someone, it may seem like God is forcing because they maybe didn't understand that he is a good God. For someone else, once they have realized he's a good God, they may say, he doesn't force us to worship him, but he does demand. But that's the greatest thing of all, because that's what makes us be who we're meant to be, truly and fully human, and to flourish as human beings.
Just like the manual on your car demands that you put oil in there, not molasses, simply because molasses is going to wreck everything. We're almost at the end of our time. It's amazing. This has been a fascinating conversation. Let me point out something just quickly. that it's really interesting. In verse 14, it says, he ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. We've spoken of the beast's wounding as a death and resurrection. And for some people, that might seem like a stretch. It says, well, he was wounded by the sword, but still lived. Yeah, that's maybe a little bit ambiguous in verse 3. But here in verse 14, it's not. It says, he wounded by the sword and yet lived. The Greek word behind that is an aorist, past tense, come to life. It's the typical verb for resurrection in the New Testament, physical, bodily resurrection. So the author of Revelation uses language here in verse 14 that clarifies this beast died and was resurrected just like Jesus was. So that's a little nugget I didn't want to miss out on. Before we close, what do you see here from the Old Testament? Is there anything or the rest of the Bible? Is the book here pointing us toward anything? Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of Nebuchadnezzar and the image that Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were forced to bow down to, and yet they refused and got thrown into the fiery furnace.
And what supports that idea is when we get to verse 15, it will you'll have the image and people commanded to worship. So good catch.
By the way, just one thing that it's important to clarify in that story. Nebuchadnezzar tried to force them, but he was not efficacious in that.
Yeah.
And that's what we find in chapters 13 and 14 of Revelation, that these beasts, there will be this making everybody worship, but we know
they don't.
Not everybody will. So they try to force everybody, but they don't succeed because some resist, right?
All right. Good one. Anything else in verses 12 through 14 that reminds you of elsewhere in the Bible? The fire
Elijah calling fire down from heaven.
Yeah, Elijah. Okay. Elijah calls fire down from heaven. And we'll come back to this when we get to Armageddon. It's a very interesting concept. But I would point out that in Elijah's day, on Mount Carmel, the fire was to demonstrate who the true God was. And this time the fire falls on the other altar. In other words, this Mount Carmel Elijah experience is a reverse, that somehow this land beast manages to fake God's fire. So there will be miracles, there will be spectacular things designed to convince people that the true God is working here. And but it's the opposite the case. Any other fire from heaven? Well, I see our time is just about up, so we'll take that up in the next program. But just wanted to share that this is an excellent discussion, particularly on the issue of freedom and force. And for this time, this week, that is GPS. We thank you for watching. I invite you to be back with us next time.